Hello, my name is Fred McMahon. I'm with Canada's Fraser Institute, and I would like to thank you all for participating today and showing your dedication to producing better lives for the people of Central America. Let me congratulate and thank Elizabeth, Fanny, and Ron for all the important work they undertake for Central America, and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for its support of freedom in Central America and around the world. What we're going to discuss today is what is economic freedom, why it's important, and the situation in Central America. Economic freedom is simply the ability of individuals and families to make their own economic decisions free of government interference or interference from the greedy crony elites. We look at size of government. If government expropriates too much of your property through taxation, it limits your economic freedom. However, government has extremely important functions to carry out. And if those functions are not carried out, then economic freedom truly suffers. And the most important of those functions is protecting private property and the rule of law. If there is not a firm and effective rule of law, the rich and the powerful or the criminal will attack the freedom of others to increase their wealth and power. This is the most critical area of economic freedom globally, and it takes on a special importance in Latin America, and particularly in Central America. Sound money, government can expropriate your property through inflation as easily as it can through taxation. Trade regulations, Central American countries need the whole world as their marketplace, not their small countries themselves, but the whole world. Small nations, Netherlands, Singapore, can become very, very wealthy and prosperous, but only if they have the whole world as their marketplace, and that's what Central America needs for its marketplace. Regulation of business, labor, and capital markets. Government should not stand in the way of businesses creating jobs and prosperity. It should not stand in the way of people getting jobs or going to work or getting loans and building capital. The Economic Freedom Project started in the mid-1980s. It was led by then Fraser Executive Director Michael Walker and Milton and Rose Friedman. It involves 60 of the world's top scholars in a number of different disciplines. It is now, we use 42 different government policies to measure economic freedom, and we include a gender disparity adjustment to recognize the fact that women all too often do not have the same economic freedom as men. Why is economic freedom important? Well, more than a century of experience has shown us that the drive, the ingenuity, and the inventiveness of free individuals and families creates prosperity in a way that no government or crony elites or criminal gangs ever have. All you have to do is look around the world to see that. Where is prosperity the highest and where is poverty the lowest? It's in nations that have high levels of economic freedom. But it's not just economic issues that It's not just economic issues where economic freedom has an impact. Economic freedom has a profound social impact too. Let me give you just one example. In a non-economically free country, you get ahead by increasing the power of government to the citizens' detriment, or you get ahead by limiting markets, forcing people to buy from you or work from you. In other words, you get ahead by limiting choice and limiting markets. You get ahead, in effect, by making people worse off. In an economically free society where there is free entry and competition and a world of choice, You only get customers. You only build your own prosperity if you create goods and services that people voluntarily want to buy in a world of choice, voluntarily want to buy because because it makes them better off. So you move from a society where you get ahead by making people worse off, either by building the power of government, building crony elites, or working in criminal gangs, to a world where you get ahead by making people better off. And that has a profound effect on the dynamics of any society. And many measurements, many studies have shown that levels of trust and honesty are much higher in economically free nations because of factors like that than they are in unfree nations. I'm going to move to reflections on the obvious. These are things that just about everybody knows, and yet somehow the critics of economic freedom create a wall in their minds between what they believe and promote and what they actually know about the world. They will tell you that free markets create poverty, and yet they know that the most prosperous nations on the planet are free markets. They will tell you that free markets are anti-democratic, and yet there has never been a stable democracy in any nation that has lacked economic freedom. So we're going to look at some of the things, at some of the factors here. The age of global free trade, free market economies, and economic freedom have brought huge benefits to humankind. The human condition has improved immensely, but the gains were most achieved by those living in economically free areas. In other words, when governments or crony elites cut off the economic freedom of their people, they cause a deterioration in the aspirations and conditions of these people deprived of economic freedom. Let's take a look at global poverty. Again, the critics of free markets say that economic freedom, free markets create poverty, and yet it's clear that poverty is concentrated in places without free markets. So let's see what's happened to extreme poverty, poverty for $1.90 a day in the era of free trade. Well, as you can see, the number of people living in extreme poverty has been cut in about half during the era of globalization, free trade, and economic freedom. But that's not the most remarkable thing. What you also see is the world's population has expanded immensely during this period of time. We've gone from, during the era of free markets, we've gone from a world where 3 in 4 people live in extreme poverty to a world in which only 1 in 10 live in extreme poverty. And those gains are in places that have economic freedom. So in the least free quartile, that's the column to your left, nearly a third of the population still live in extreme poverty. In the most free nations, extreme poverty has almost disappeared. And some people will try to argue that that's because the nations where poverty is low that are prosperous today were always prosperous. And it's inherited low poverty. But that's not the case at all. Just take the example of South Korea or Singapore. Both were absolutely devastated by Japanese occupation during the Second World War. And then South Korea went through one of the most, or Korea as a whole went through one of the most brutal civil wars in human history, dividing the country into North and South Korea. Singapore is a small spit of land that is mostly swamp, yet Singapore and South Korea, not rich to start with, both devastated, turned to free markets, turned to economic freedom, and now produce some of the best lives on the planet for their people. So yes, anyone, anywhere who turns to any nation anywhere that turns to economic freedom can dramatically lower poverty in their country and improve their people. And here's the real miracle. Because economic freedom produces so much prosperity, even for the poor, the income of the poorest 10% in economically free nations is about $14,000 a year US, purchasing power parity adjusted. The poorest 10%, $14,000 a year US. In the least free countries, the poorest 10% earn only about $1,000 a year. The same thing is true about the growth of prosperity. Per capita GDP has expanded immensely during the era of free markets and economic freedom. But again, these gains are concentrated in the most economically free nations. So the average per capita income in the most free countries in the world, the quarter most free on the column on your right, is over US $50,000 a year. It's 10 times more than the average income in the least free countries of $5,000 a year. Literacy, same thing as with poverty, or very close. The number of people who are illiterate in the world, that's the dark blue, has shrunk dramatically by about a third, not as much as extreme poverty, but shrunk dramatically during the era of free markets and free trade. But again, that's not counting the incredible growth of the population. So we have gone from a world in which, during the era of free markets, a world in which about 2 in 3 people were literate, to a world in which only about 1 in 8 people are illiterate. And again, literacy is the highest in economically free nations, around 95%. But in uneconomically free nations, it's much lower. And one of the interesting and sad things is the gap between men and women, girls and boys in education is much, much larger in uneconomically free countries. That's because in uneconomically free countries, people can't make their own way. They're judged on who they know, who their family is, what gang or tribe they're part of. So improving your skills and education is not as important as it is in economically free countries where people make their own way and they're judged on what they can do, what their skills, what their education are. And that encourages and incentivizes families to make sure their children, male and female, are educated and literate. Life expectancy, about the same. Again, a huge increase over the era of free trade. And again, that increase is concentrated most in economically free nations, as you can see. Now, I'm not going to go over this slide in detail because I've described it as we've gone along. The condition of humanity has improved immensely during the time of free markets and economic freedom. And the people who have gained the most are those people that live in nations that are economically free. Couple last things. You often hear the critics of free markets claim that free markets are anti-democratic. As I've already mentioned, you can't find a stable democracy anywhere in the world that does not have a high level of economic freedom. In other words, lack of economic freedom is what is anti-democratic and anti-freedom. And as you can see from this chart, that the lowest quartile in economic freedom has a much, much lower level of other freedoms and democracy. Political rights is another way of saying democracy. And here's my favorite chart. Critics of free markets will say, well, maybe economic freedom does produce higher levels of prosperity. In fact, they're throwing their own argument under the bus. They're admitting the failure of it. But they say, well, what we're really interested in is life satisfaction, happiness, and who can be happy, who can be satisfied in a dog-eat-dog free market world. Well, as it turns out, just about everyone. People in places with economic freedom have immensely higher levels of happiness than people in places without economic freedom. And that holds even when you correct for the lower levels of poverty and higher levels of prosperity and health and education in economically free nations. As it turns out, people actually like to be free. They don't like having their lives run by government or run by crony elites. They like to run their own lives, and that creates higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction. We're coming to the end, but I'm going to take a quick look at economic freedom around the world and in Central America. This is what's happened to economic freedom globally. The benefits of economic freedom are so great that despite the critics, economic freedom has been increasing globally. Even after the Great Recession, there was a dip, but growth continued. This is how Central America, in red, compares with the world and with South America. And it looks like, well, it looks like Central America might have fairly high level of economic freedom, a little better than what you see in Eastern Europe, far, far away from what you see in Western Europe or North America. But here's the problem. Where Central America does well is in size of government. It has relatively small governments, but that's no gain for economic freedom. That's no gain for economic freedom if the government cannot provide a sound legal system and protect the economic freedom of all. And as you'll see here by looking at the legal system, Central America and South America are below the world average in providing a fair legal system to their people. And the nations that are in the top quarter of economic freedom provide powerful, strong, and fair legal systems that produce prosperity and lower poverty. Because I'm at about my time's limit, I'll only briefly mention look at economic freedom and the rule of law across Central America. And what you see is that while the economic freedom scores may look fairly good, with the partial exception of Panama and Costa Rica, the rule of law in Central America is tragically low. And until that challenge is met, it is going to be impossible to build prosperity for everyone in Central America. All the data produced by the Fraser Institute and all our publications are available for free download at this web address. Thank you so much for spending your time today and for showing your dedication to the future of Latin America, of Central America, and producing better lives for the people of Central America. Thank you.